Welcome. I am delighted to open this hearing on the Western Hemisphere Committee, and we will now come to order. Before I begin my remarks, I just want to give a shout out to the good senator from Virginia to my right, and tell him how much I appreciate the opportunity to work together with him on this. We had a chance to meet a little earlier in this week, and there are a lot of really good bipartisan issues for this committee to delve into, and delighted and honored to sit next to you here, Senator. Thank you. I used to be a Virginian, and we were talking. He was serving on the city council in the city where I lived when I lived in Virginia, and it's interesting how things turn out. Today marks 5 years since my bill, the Taiwan Allies International Protection and Enhancement Act, Taipei Act, was signed into law. This bipartisan act that I sponsored in the House, which passed unanimously through Congress, has been pivotal in protecting Taiwan's remaining diplomatic allies from Beijing's coercion. The Taipei Act strengthens Taiwan's position in the world by promoting deeper trade with Taiwan, supporting Taiwan's participation in international organizations, and most importantly, protecting Taiwan's relations with its allies. In short, it sent a loud message of U.S. support for Taiwan, making clear that we stand with our democratic partners and will not tolerate attempts to isolate Taiwan. I'm proud of the Taipei Act's legacy and hope this subcommittee hearing serves as reaffirmation of this 5-year anniversary. The Taipei Act came as a response to Beijing's intensified campaign in the Western Hemisphere and the Pacific aimed at prying away Taiwan's allies. In Latin America and the Caribbean, this pressure is increasing. Specifically, the Taipei Act came as a response to Panama, the Dominican Republic, and El Salvador switching diplomatic recognition. Not only did they switch diplomatic recognition, but they adopted China's one China's principle, or China's claim that Taiwan is part of China. Honduras became the latest to switch recognition in 2023, severing its 82-year alliance with Taiwan after making exorbitant demand for billions in aid that Taiwan wasn't able to fill, but Beijing did for a price. Even regional institutions have not been spared. The Central American Parliament was pressured to expel Taiwan's observer and replace it with China, underscoring the breadth of China's influence campaign in our backyard. Beijing's tactics in our hemisphere are increasingly blatant. State Department officials have rightfully likened China's approach in our region to the 19th century imperialism, bribing local leaders with investments in ways that lead to debt dependency. Make no mistake, China's goal is to isolate Taiwan completely, with the goal of silencing international dissent if China forces unification on Taiwan, and it is deploying every tool at its disposal to achieve that end in our very own hemisphere. It is squarely in the United States' national interest to push back against Beijing's encroachment in our own backyard and to support those nations that continue to stand with Taiwan. China's influence efforts in the Western Hemisphere threaten not only Taiwan's position in the world, but also global stability and U.S. interest. We must respond with equal resolve. That means redoubling our engagement with Taiwan's remaining allies to ensure they have strong economic and security incentives to stick with Taiwan. The Taipei Act charts that course. The U.S. should prioritize support and diplomatic engagement with countries that maintain ties with Taiwan and consider downgrading relations with those who bow to Beijing. This aligns with the Trump administration goal of ensuring our dollars spent abroad are making America more safe, secure, and prosperous. That is why I will join a bipartisan group of House and Senate colleagues next week to introduce the Taiwan Allies Fund Act, which I view as a natural follow-up to the Taipei Act. This bill sets aside a portion of the already appropriated Countering PRC Malign Influence Fund to focus on helping countries that stand strong in the face of PRC pressure and maintain our strengthened ties with Taiwan. We cannot allow the Chinese Communist Party to buy out Taiwan's friends in our own backyard. We will continue to stand shoulder to shoulder with Taiwan and help it shore up its allies, countering Beijing's coercion at every turn. Taiwan's allies in this hemisphere have shown courage and loyalty in the face of intense pressure. The United States will not abandon them. On the contrary, we will strengthen our alliances with these partners, rejecting authoritarian influence. Together, we send a clear message. Taiwan is not alone, and the Western Hemisphere will not become a playground for the PRC. I want to go off script just a little bit, because I think it's really important for anybody watching this today to understand why this matters. So, Dr. Evans and then Ms. Custer, if you would start, why does this matter? Why does hanging on to these countries matter for the United States?
It's an excellent point. Senator, it's an excellent point, and I think one that's very important for us to be clear on. So first of all, from the perspective of the conflict or the rivalry with the PRC, understanding that as the number of allies that Taiwan has goes towards zero, in the context of increasing military and other superiority in Asia by the PRC, the temptation is that brings us closer to a war in Asia. The extent to which Taiwan is seen as not isolated, I think, at least is one of the factors that keeps us farther away from that war. Also understanding that if Taiwan is lost as an autonomous democratic ally in Asia, that geographically allows the PLA and PLA Navy to project itself out beyond Guam into the Indo-Pacific to Hawaii and to the U.S. coast. But also looking just at Latin America and the PRC economic but also military and political advance in Latin America. The way, and I've shown this time and time again in my own research, the most rapid way for the PRC to advance in military and economic terms is when you have a flip, because that flip is associated with non-transparent MOUs. It is associated with often free trade agreements, which open up markets to PRC companies in sectors like electricity and telecommunications and others. It's typically associated with the establishment of Confucius Institutes, training programs for government officials, and a range of other things. And frankly, if we look at which states still continue to recognize Taiwan, they are states ever closer to the United States. They're in the Caribbean, in the U.S., maritime approaches, as well as in Central America if we talk about Guatemala and Belize. In other words, it becomes a national security imperative and really one of the best ways to push back against the PRC. And frankly, at the end of the day, also for both the region itself and also for the United States, Taiwan is an excellent democratic ally. It's a partner with very good development projects, even if at a smaller scale. And it's a good partner for coordinating to push forward democracy and help to address and promote the conditions in the region of the types of regimes that we in the U.S. would like to have.
Thank you.
I would add to that three things. So first, it matters economically. Taiwan is the leading supplier and producer of semiconductors in the world that the U.S. economy relies upon. So not only would it disrupt our economy, but some estimates indicate that if Taiwan were to fold, that would have probably about a 10% disruption to the global economy. So that's big.
That's a big deal.
Geopolitically, the U.S. is actively trying to advance its interests with the PRC across the globe. If we fold on Taiwan, if we see diplomatic allies being hemorrhaged away from Taiwan, that gives China essentially a major victory in this competitive battle. And then finally, from a security perspective, I think the more that countries in the region tip into China's camp away from Taiwan, that increases exposure for the U.S. to things like these dual-use ports, these emphases on space observatories and like that strengthen China's hand.
So just a point on that, you mentioned the 10% hit. I think that's to our GDP. To put that in comparison, the Great Depression was 7%. So you want to understand what type of an impact, that's dramatic. Thank you. I also want to use this opportunity to point out, oftentimes when we have these conversations, it feels like we're talking about the Chinese people, and I want to be really clear. I think Americans love the Chinese people, love the Chinese culture. That's not where our problem is. It's an authoritarian government that's more oppressive on its own people than anyone else. And I just think that's really important to designate for our conversation. Dr. Ellis, let's go to the Panama Canal. You mentioned that just briefly, and I think you rightly said that these two ports were not yet transferred, but we've got some hope here that these are moving out of those hands. After Secretary Rubio's visit, Panama announced it was pulling out of the Belt and Road Initiative, which it joined when it switched diplomatic recognition. Given these developments, is there a pathway to get Panama at least to upgrade their relationships with Taiwan and perhaps give some type of representation, even if it's a representative's office or something like that? How do you see that playing out there in Panama?
Senator, I think it's a great and important question, and I think I would address three different pieces. Number one, I think the Belt and Road changeover, Panama's renouncing of the Belt and Road was important, but it's important also to recognize that it was symbolic. It contractually doesn't necessarily get the United States any greater security, but again, I think it's a move in the right direction, and we should continue to press for that option with other states in the region as well. With respect to a representative office, a TECRO type office, again, I think that's a possibility. But I think both the administration, the Secretary Rubio at State, and this Congress should be ready to fully defend it. I remember when our friends in Guyana, the Irfan Ali government, a couple of years back, tried to allow Taiwan to open up an office, and the PRC pressure was so strong that within, I think, 3 hours, they were forced to double back on that. And so I think we should absolutely press for that as a doable thing, but we should be ready to defend it. And the other thing I think is we have some opportunity as we move in the right direction with respect to the BlackRock deal, but we should also be attentive to the fact that Chinese actors in the PRC are trying to reverse that deal, even with their delegation that came just days ago. Also, there are risks from other operators such as Costco, such as the possibility of a new Panama clone container port in which the China-friendly company NoTorque could operate, as well as actors such as Huawei and others. And so I think we need to continue to be vigilant in that area, and certainly be prepared to not only press forward, but also follow through in things like TECRO offices.
Thank you.
Adding to that, I think there is a momentum that we're seeing in Panama right now. You think about the fact that Panama is one of only 2 countries in the world that has announced that it's backing out of China's Belt and Road Initiative, and that's significant. In terms of this recognition chain that I talked about before, from no relations to the tacit kind of liaison office to the full, I think the risks for countries in the region, or the pain that they feel, is highest when they go all the way to full recognition. That middle ground, the fence-sitters don't seem to be paying as much of a cost to do that. So I think with the right economic incentives, the right support from the U.S., there definitely could be an opportunity to get a liaison office in Panama.
And on that note, I'll turn to a few questions of my own. Ms. Custer, you talked about Taiwan telling its story, and I want to just point out, in 1979, I actually lived in Taiwan, and Taiwan was under martial law at the time. And the United States put a lot of time and energy into our relationship with China, and to some degree, we pulled back, well, not to some degree, we pulled back our diplomatic relationships with Taiwan. And now you let that time pass between 1979 and now, and you have a full-force democracy, prospering, doing well, freedom for their people, and you have, of course, China has gone the opposite direction. And I think that is a fabulous story to tell, one we really should be shouting from the housetops here in Washington, D.C. Dr. Ellis, let me have you put on your former state policy planning staff hat. And did you see evidence of Chinese interference in local electoral processes, or overt efforts to sway political leaders to sever their relationships with Taiwan?
Yes, sir. So first of all, I think it's important to understand how it is multifaceted, and I probably should, and I'm going to speak in terms of having followed this for about 20 plus years as an academic, and certainly the unclassified portion of what I saw while I was at the State Department. But what you see again is this weaving of a tapestry of all level. It's the economic blackmail selectively applied that we saw before. It's the whispering in the ears of business lobbies in agricultural and in other sectors. It is the bringing people over to the PRC in terms of journalists or others to try to get favorable coverage and access. It is sometimes the inappropriate things. I'll mention one specific case that I haven't mentioned yet, of course, which was the flip of Taiwan. Now, I've spoken with President Varela, and I know that he would deny that there was a quid pro quo, but it did not go unnoticed among people that right after he flipped to the PRC in 2017, that the family-run business that was in his brother's name suddenly got a really big contract from the PRC. Similarly, it was not unnoticed that his Vice Minister Nicole Wong, again, who I know, a wonderful person, very bright person, but after she played a critical role in that flip. Literally just months later, she got a very cushy job representing China Harbor Engineering Corporation. And so I think there is this sense of, both the offers and does China play dirty, and including some of the more, the indirect electoral things. And if I may, just one more thing, and Ms. Custer also alluded to this, but really to emphasize the promise of benefit is often an unrealized promise. I have done several studies which have been published looking at IMF data, in which you actually see that if you look at the 2 to 3 years after recognition, when you include both what is lost from Taiwan and what is gained from the PRC, in almost every single case, it is either flat or it falls. In part, that's because some of the traditional products, such as coffee and fruit, there's no real reason for the PRC to bring them in refrigerated containers halfway around the world when they can get the same product from Vietnam or the Philippines. That's oftentimes a symbolic thing. At the same time, their export agencies oftentimes don't have the expertise that they need. And indeed, when you look at the actual investment projects, there's a certain amount of work that is done, paid for by those countries, but not in Panama, not in Costa Rica with the disastrous Route 32 project, not in the Dominican Republic, where something like $600 million of electricity projects were promised that never happened, not even in El Salvador, where there was talk about La Union. In almost every single case, those promises have been empty, but it's those hopes that often are sold, whereas I think that the benefits that Taiwan provides, often right-sized for our partners, are something that's much more tangible to their benefit.
Thank you. Ms. Custer, did you want to comment on that?
Yes,
Sure.
please, sir. So first, picking up on this, we call that buyer's remorse. You asked me earlier, Senator Kane, about how we see things differently in Latin America than in other parts of the world. One is the newness of a lot of these relationships. I field surveys of private, public, and civil society leaders in 141 low and middle income countries, including many in Latin America. And what you see are differences in how leaders think about what they've gotten in the relationship with China. And you see a lot more skepticism and doubt starting to flood in places like East Asia and Pacific, for example, where these countries have a longer history with a lot of these projects, where you're starting to see not only the promises, but the delays, the disruptions, the challenges environmentally, challenges with governance and corruption. And so this has soured things a little bit. Other studies have shown that China gets a public perception bump when it announces a new project, but it actually has a decline at the end of these projects. So those are the stories that actually aren't really being told yet in Latin America, but there's an opportunity there for learning. And then,
Before you leave that, can I ask us, can you bifurcate the difference between that reaction from people on the ground and the leaders? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when I talk about leaders, it's a fairly broad way of defining it. So mid to senior government officials, civil society leaders, private sector leaders. Typically, these leaders are thinking about a slightly different set of agenda items than citizens. Citizens are often historically undecided when it comes to China, but you do see a souring of public opinion, mostly in terms of reaction to news media, but also a souring when it comes to what's happening in particular communities that are affected by these projects. When it comes to leaders, what is a more compelling case is, where am I going to get financing for infrastructure projects? And I'm looking to China. And so there is a little bit of a difference there, but even in places like the East Asian Pacific region, you're seeing a souring on both counts.